about 4 or 5 weeks ago called Godzilla: The First 70 Years. It covers all the total productions, live action and anime, from 1954 through Godzilla -1, basically up to the Academy Award. So we're really proud of this. This is a licensed book from Toho. It's got 900 and some odd pictures in it, including a lot of behind-the-scenes production stills. And I'm sitting right over there across the hallway, so if anybody's interested in checking it out, we've got some copies today. But for today, what we're going to do is kind of keep it high level. This is 70 years of history, and that's a lot to cover in less than an hour. So we're just going to kind of keep it general, keep it light, keep it fun. But I want to talk a little bit about the origins and the history, and we'll try to get through as much history as we can in the short amount of time that we do have. And now where's my clicker? Oh, there it is. So, again, I've been writing about this stuff for a long time, and like a lot of you, I love Godzilla. I love this kind of movie. I grew up in Los Angeles watching these films primarily on television, and even though I watched all kinds of horror movies, all kinds of science fiction movies at that time, the Japanese movies really appealed to me in a special way, largely because the monsters were so incredible and so fantastic, and there's so much imagination in these films, but also I think because they're from Japan, they're from this mysterious place. Again, the world was a little different when I was growing up. There was no internet, and there wasn't even home video yet. But these films always intrigued me on the level that I really think I'm only really just now beginning to understand as an adult. The more I spent quite a bit of my life actually devoted to this stuff. So it's a history of destruction. That's one of the things that really appeals to me about this film, and I'm sure to you too, the spectacle of destruction. But why are we looking at these movies now, looking back on the history of them at 70 years? Well, I think we're at a really interesting point in time because, as you may know, these films were kind of disregarded and disrespected for a long period of time. Right now, they're at their peak of their popularity. I went to Comic-Con a few weeks ago. I used to go to Comic-Con and search for Godzilla stuff. There was nothing. A few things, a few scraps. Godzilla was everywhere. And that's largely due to things like the Legendary franchise. The popularity of those films has certainly assisted with the overall popularity of Godzilla around the world. Godzilla -1, of course, exploded and won the Academy Award. But we're at a point now where these films are being studied by college students, both at the undergrad and grad level. People are writing their master's theses and their doctoral dissertations on them. Of course, they're part of their Criterion collection. And as I mentioned, not too long ago, Godzilla -1 won the Academy Award for Visual Effects. And at a point in time, not too long ago, that was unthinkable. And it's quite a remarkable turnaround for the fortunes of Godzilla. I just want to talk a little bit about the distinction between, we're talking about 70 years of Kaiju today, right? What's the difference between the word monster or the concept of a monster and Kaiju? It's a subtle thing, but I think it's an important one to kind of launch this discussion from. Monsters in the Western sense, and I'm really overgeneralizing now, but monsters in the Western sense generally come out of folklore and our literary traditions, and they're generally humanoid creatures. And of course, we have giant monsters of our own, but they're generally, in their origins, humanoid creatures, recognizably human, that have been afflicted with some sort of either deformity or disease, or in the case of the Invisible Man or Frankenstein, science gone wrong. In the case of, now certainly Japan has its own tradition of ghost stories and things like that, but the word kaiju, it pre-existed Godzilla, but it really, Godzilla is the urtext or the origins of the concept, the modern concept of the kaiju. And these creatures in Japanese science fiction films, there are these recognizable tropes that they follow, generally a monster coming out of the ocean or arriving from somewhere and destroying the cities. And what just happened? Oh, there we go. We were having a little trouble with this guy earlier. Oh, here we go. One of the distinctions, though, is that Japanese monsters, and this is certainly true of Godzilla, as you know, are born out of tragedy and trauma. I think it's pretty widely understood and accepted by now that Godzilla is, in its original state, it arrived here as a metaphorical representation of the atomic bomb. what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As you probably know, the filmmakers, particularly Ishiro Honda, the original director, had fought in World War II, and he had actually witnessed the aftermath of Hiroshima when he was repatriated after the war. And it left a scar on him. And then so many people working in the film industry, not just on this film, were affected by the war in immediate ways, and they carried that into their work. And certainly Godzilla is not unique in this regard, but it is characterized and defined by this. And throughout that first film, there are images that really represent and are evocative of actual footage and photographs from the war. This photograph on the left is from Time magazine. It was taken by a photographer in the immediate aftermath of the atomic bombing. And look, there's a scene, and this may be pure happenstance, but it nonetheless is very evocative of actual records of the war. There are numerous scenes in the film that depict scenes of destruction that are really representative or really, remind us of what happened in real life. So this wasn't by accident. So one of the main differences that I just want to point out before we go forward, of course, Godzilla arrived at this time in our history when there were so many of these fantastic science fiction films that were coming out in the wake of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race and all the fear that was associated with that. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was an immediate influence on Godzilla. The producer, who I'll talk about in a second, Tomoyuki Tanaka, was inspired by the success and the popularity of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which, by the way, is about a dinosaur reawakened by a nuclear test that goes to New York and tramples the city there. But the difference between what happens in these atomic monster movies that were so popular in the 1950s in the United States, coming out of Hollywood, is they're very speculative. We, of course, were fearful, or our parents or grandparents were fearful of the nuclear war, but they had no clear idea of what that would look like, whereas the Japanese had experienced it. So the images of destruction in films like Rodan and the Mysterians and Mothra and Godzilla are far more vivid. I mean, they went the extra mile and actually depicted scenes of apocalyptic destruction on their cities. It's kind of funny, I mean, not funny, but when you look at it today, and there's so many of these big budget Hollywood movies where they basically end with the world on the brink of total destruction. If you look back at the origins of science fiction cinema, particularly these giant monster films of the 50s, they never went that far because we didn't have a point of reference in the way that the Japanese did. So that's why I say the Japanese films are about what next, what happens now. They've already experienced one level of destruction. And of course, Japan is a country that in its history, throughout its history, has experienced many earthquakes, tsunamis, all kinds of natural disasters. And of course, they've had the nuclear disaster at Hiroshima and also at Fukushima. So it's a country that has experienced this type of trauma many times, and it's represented in their films. And of course, Dr. Serizawa and many of the characters, that's another difference between the two. Many of the characters, especially in that early period of the 1950s, resolved the story with a self-sacrifice, just as Serizawa did to defeat Godzilla. I'll get the hang of this clicker, by the way. Let's talk about the films and kind of go in chronological order. And again, I have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to kind of go pretty fast here. And I know a lot of you guys are probably really knowledgeable, and some of this is going to be really remedial for you, but I hope you'll find some new and interesting factoids in here as well. Now, the Godzilla films in Japan are really associated with the eras. In this country, we tend to think of things in terms of decades, and I will approach them in that fashion because it's just easier for me. But in terms of the Japanese way of thinking about these types of films and a lot of different things, they're associated with the era of the emperor during which they were made. So the first cycle of Godzilla films is generally referred to as the Showa films. Some of the key figures that, and there are many people who are responsible for these films and for the success of them, but three people whose names you may be familiar with, and I want to keep them in mind because they're so important to this type of film. Tomoyuki Tanaka was the producer who came up with the idea for the first Godzilla film. Again, he was somebody who he became through his association with Godzilla and with other big important films that were made during this time period.
He became one of the top producers at Toho, which is one of the big studios and still remains one of the big studios, although the business has totally changed in Japan. He came up with the idea because he was aware of the success of the re-release of King Kong across the United States and the world in the early 50s. He also, again, was really acutely aware of the success of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Eiji Tsuburaya was a highly innovative cameraman and really experimented with all types of different special effects and photography techniques. He won lots of awards in the 1930s and 40s especially. He developed his technique for using miniaturization largely on war propaganda films that were made in concert with the Japanese government. And Ishiro Honda, oh geez, are there any kids here? I guess that photo's not entirely appropriate. But Ishiro Honda is the director of the first Godzilla film and many of the sequels. He's really responsible for establishing the tone. First cycle, basically the second half of the 50s, going clockwise from the upper left, that's Godzilla, Godzilla Reigns Again, Rodan, The Mysterians, a film called The H-Man, which I hope some of you have seen. It's not really a kaiju film, but it's more of a science fiction. They call them in Japan these body transformation films. It's about a bunch of nuclear goblins running amok in Tokyo, and the one in the lower right is Varan the Unbelievable. I just show these because the first cycle of the films is very dark and very pessimistic. None of these films really has a happy ending. They often end with somebody sacrificing themselves to save the day or to defeat the monster. So that is really indicative of the tenor of the times. Japan, after the occupation, still went through for a number of years a really tough time. The economy took, you probably heard about Japan's economic miracle that really was given rise in the 60s, but in the second half of the 50s, Japan was really still recovering and trying to get back on its feet, even though it had the assistance of the United States. It took a long time for its exporting and all these other things to get going before Japanese citizens started to enjoy the fruits of their labor. But at the dawn of the 1960s, things did start to change, and that really affected not only this genre, but cinema, Japanese cinema as a whole. How many of you have seen the film on the far left? That's the poster for the original Mothra from 1961. Now, what changed with the release of Mothra? Do you have any thoughts about what's different between Mothra, say, and Godzilla, which was made just 7 years earlier?
Color.
It's in color, yes, but in this isn't about a villain monster. This is actually the monster wins in this movie because the monster is on the side of the good. The monster is trying to rescue its muses, which are a pair of twin fairies who are kidnapped by a greedy capitalist who is kind of quasi-American, and who it's actually an anagram of the King Kong story. That's the wrong word, but it's analogous to King Kong, but instead of the monster being taken to the city and forced to perform on stage, it's these fairies, and the monster comes to rescue them. So, and actually, director Honda acknowledged that this was basically his version of King Kong. But it's a fantasy. It has music. You remember the Mothra song, probably? It's much different than Godzilla, and they had realized in the second half of the 50s that they were kind of starting to repeat themselves, so that folks at Toho started to look for different ways to re-energize this formula. King Kong versus Godzilla, the second film in this triptych here, it's still the most highly attended Godzilla film in Japan of all time,
Really?
in terms of sheer number of tickets sold. It rode the crest of popularity based on the sheer hype of having King Kong and Godzilla face off, of course, but it also was a bright, cheerful, comedic film. It's actually a hybrid of the kaiju film and the comedy. And the film on the far right, that's Frankenstein Conquers the World. I was just chatting outside with somebody who really likes this film. That's one of the things that's interesting about this time period. Both Mothra and Frankenstein Conquers the World are co-ventures between Toho and an American company, American studio. Actually, Columbia put money into the direction of Mothra. And Frankenstein Conquers the World was made with a company called Lupier. Because these films were so popular in the United States, I didn't even mention the fact that Godzilla, when it was brought to America, was remade with Raymond Burr inserted into the picture, and that's one of the reasons that it exploded across the United States, because it basically was disguised as an American picture. Well, by now these films were really popular in the drive-ins and in the inner city type theaters where these type of pictures were shown, kind of beat pictures of the way they were approached in the United States. And American companies started putting money into them, and so that they could have the rights to the pictures, to distribute the pictures in the Western territories. But also they started, especially UPA, and you may be familiar with this aspect of them. UPA started sending these kind of semi-washed up Hollywood stars to Japan to act in these films, so that when they came over, yes, you would still have to dub the Japanese actors into English, but they had a Western face, an American face. And this is Nick Adams, who appeared in 2 of these films, and also Russ Tamblyn appeared in a film called The War of the Gargantuas. This is how I used to see these films back in the day, okay? They used to show on television here in Los Angeles. This is KTLA Channel 5. I don't even know if that's still the call letters of that station. I watched so many of these films on KTLA because back in the day, I guess they didn't have a big programming budget. They would run the same movie 5 times a week. So by the end of the week, I needed the dialogue. This is probably a TV guide ad from the 70s, but this film is from 1966, and it's really kind of like the mid-60s heyday of the kaiju film. Now, as you know, Godzilla transformed over time. It arrived as an atomic terror, an allegory for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bomb, the nuclear arms race. But over time, it became associated with these monster versus monster fights, starting in this is the film in the middle is Godzilla Raids Again. It's the first Godzilla sequel, but it's also the first of many, many battles against other creatures. By the mid to late 60s, Godzilla becomes an adopted parent. It adopts the, yes. I've had a lot of questions about Minya this weekend, and here he is. Cute little guy, right? Looks just like his dad. Actually, Toho insists that Minya, actually the official name is Minya, but in the English dubs of these films, it was always pronounced Minya. It insists that this is an adopted child, which is an interesting wrinkle in the story. So continuing the Showa era, so Godzilla actually at one point, because of the changing nature of the fortunes of Japan, the Japanese people, and the brighter outlook and the economic resurgence of the country, and the fact that the war is more and more in the rearview mirror. Nuclear fears are starting to become, secondary to consumer pleasures and things like that. The attitude and the sort of tone of these films really shifts in the 60s and in the second half of the 60s. Godzilla goes from being, this symbol of destruction to basically becoming an anti-hero. You may remember the film Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. That's the one where it starts its transformation and comes over to the side of mankind, reluctantly so. By the 1970s, Godzilla was fighting pollution. It's true. And this was one of the big trade-offs of the economic miracle of Japan, this heavy industrialization and all the policies that, they really didn't bring pollution under control until sometime in the mid-70s or so. And so the film Godzilla vs. Hedorah from 1971, in that film, Godzilla is playing the hero, but the antagonist monster is basically a big, giant pile of sludge that comes to life. And by the 70s, Godzilla was a matinee star. These films, by now, the audience for these films was very, very young. And so the films from like 1969 on were being released only as children's matinee films. So this was the time when Godzilla tucked his tail through the air, between his legs and flew through the air. And he also did this. Never, ever live that down. All right. I'm just going to, again, talk about a couple of key figures. I don't think we'd be standing here today talking about Godzilla if it weren't for these two individuals as well. Haruo Nakajima, who passed away just a few years ago, was the principal actor inside, spoiler alert, Godzilla was a man in a suit. Haruo Nakajima was so dedicated to the role. He played the monster from 1954 to 1972 with very few exceptions. And it's his personality, his acting, it's acting inside that suit. And it's very hard to convey emotion through something that's hundreds of pounds and you're sweating, pounds off as you do your work. He loved his work. He was very proud of the job that he did. And all the personality that comes through in all those Godzilla films, especially the 1960s, are really all due to the performances of Nakajima. The other person to mention is Akira Ifukube, the composer, who created this amazing music that's associated with this genre. Again, this type of music, it really supersedes it takes the material to a level that it never would have been able to achieve on its own, just visually. And so I really ascribe a lot of the success and even people who are just super casual fans of this type of film can usually hum a few bars of the Godzilla theme and the Mothra theme. And there on the far right is Ifukube with some nerd. Actually me, I got to meet him and interview him at his home. He passed away a number of years ago, but during the early days of my research on this type of film, I was able to meet with him and interview him. Throughout this slide deck, I'm going to be sharing some screen captures from our book, which we're very proud of, and just to kind of show you what's in the book and why it's so awesome, because it is a licensed book, and we were able to get, as I said, 900 photos from Toho's archives. But one of the things that happened when Godzilla's popularity really started to slide in the 1970s, the last film in the original Showa series, Terror of Mechagodzilla from 1975, had the lowest attendance in the entire series. And it was just at the point where Japanese cinema in general wasn't performing nearly as well as it had been a decade earlier. And these films were becoming old hat. The audience was just basically kids at that point, and they, instead of figuring out how to reboot it or reinvent it, Godzilla basically went into retirement or forced retirement for about 9 years. But during that time, the producer Tanaka that I mentioned, he was constantly trying to come up with a way to reinvent this character. He knew that it was basically Toho's bread and butter, so he was trying to find a way to make it relevant again. One of the things that happened, well, two things that happened. You see that, I don't know if it's big enough for you to see, but there's a graphic in the upper and the right-hand column on the sort of the, left side of the right column. That's a poster or some artwork for a film that was not made. But one of the things, this is the original time when Tanaka went out into the world and tried to get a Godzilla film made in Hollywood. This is a promotional piece of art for a project that was called Godzilla King of the Monsters in 3D. It was going to be made with stop motion animation, and it was to be directed by a fellow named Steve Miner. And it actually didn't get all the way to pre-production, but it was a full script with various drafts that were made, and there were 2 or 3 production companies and studios, including Universal, that were really super interested in making it, but the budget was always the sort of tipping point. Nobody wanted to spend $25, $30, $40 million at that time. Was a fair amount of money on a Godzilla movie. Anyway, one thing that happened in the late 70s was the 3 Mile Island accident in Pennsylvania, where a nuclear power plant sort of meltdown, and there was widespread panic, and the people of Japan saw this, and an anti-nuclear power movement started to gain momentum in Japan, because of course Japan is a nation that its entire economic resurgence is largely dependent on the advent of and the development of nuclear power. So when Godzilla came back in 1984 in this film, The Return of Godzilla, the concept was rethought. Not only now was Godzilla essentially a metaphor or a representation of atomic weapons, nuclear weapons, but now Godzilla also was a warning against the dangers of nuclear power. And in the introductory scene where we first meet the monster again, the newfangled version of Godzilla, it is feeding on the radiation from a nuclear power plant. And they've never done that before. And now this becomes, going forward, a key part of Godzilla's reason for being, its mythology. But these films didn't necessarily set the world on fire, but Tanaka was determined again to make Godzilla relevant. Godzilla vs. Biollante, it's an imperfect film, but it's really interesting. And one of the things that's really key about this, Toho is a traditional, or was a traditional movie studio in the Japanese system, in a sense. It was patterned largely after the Hollywood system, going back to, say, the 1930s or so, where you had in-house directors and in-house actors and so forth. But by this point in time, the studio system, as it had been known, was really breaking up. And this is the first time, Godzilla vs. Biollante, where Tanaka went outside the Toho director system and hired a young independent director to make a film and to give that person the freedom to basically put their own stamp on Godzilla. And he came up with this story, Godzilla versus Biollante. Biollante is a kind of this flytrap monster that's kind of cloned off of Godzilla's cells, sort of. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the two. But he had a far different take. His type of filmmaking was much more influenced by American films, and it has quite a different feel than the previous films. And so these two films begat a new series, we call it the Heisei era series, because it's associated with the reign of Emperor Akihito. But I put an asterisk there because it's not exactly right. But anyway, that's how they're known. I'll explain later if you want to read in the hallway. But anyway, during this time period, as you may know, I spoke to a lot of people this weekend that love these Heisei films. They're basically like reinventions of the Showa films. But Godzilla's much more serious, none of the clowning and the flying through the air and kangaroo kicks. Godzilla is mean and determined, and it's much more serious in tone, even though Godzilla is much more serious in tone, even though films like Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah are that, you know what, crazy. This film is really entertaining to me. It's highly imperfect, but again, the guy who made this, Omori, the same guy who made the last film, had a really strong affinity for American films. So the Back to the Future is a great influence on his thinking for this film. There's a character that's influenced by the Terminator films. And you have these three visitors from the future who basically come back to try to erase Godzilla from history. But then they pull a double cross and they create Mecha King Ghidorah, and it's really crazy. So what they were doing essentially is reintroducing these monsters like King Ghidorah and Mothra and Mechagodzilla. Mechagodzilla, of course, is a cyborg, but I mean, reintroducing these monsters and characters from the classic films and doing them over with better special effects or updated special effects. But in the 1990s, while Hollywood was already going in the route of in the direction of CG, the budgets for these films were still around $10 million max. So, and in Japan at that time, that's actually quite an expensive film. But they didn't have the technology or even really, at this point, the desire to go in the digital direction. They were still largely, the crews on these films largely were made up of people who either had worked on the old films or were trained by the people who had worked on the old films. And I would stress to you that the people who make this type of handmade special effects type of film are really, they take a great deal of pride in their work. And there's a tradition that went on for many, many decades. And it's only just now, kind of in the last decade or so, given way to the digital revolution. There was a lot of desire to hang on to that tradition. And of course, in one of the other characters that sprouts up in these films is a new baby Godzilla, which is much cuter than the last one. So yeah, in the Heisei era, as it came to a close in the mid-1990s, again, Godzilla continues to evolve. It is a protected parent. One of the other characters that I love so much from the old days was Rodan, and you see here Godzilla facing off with Rodan in a film called Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. It's actually protecting an egg. These two monsters are both fighting over custody of an egg that will soon hatch this creature. Actually, this is a mystery that no one seems to know the solution to, but this character, Little Godzilla, is supposedly the same creature that you saw in the previous slide, which looked much more like a kaiju. Anyway. So in 1995, in a film called Godzilla vs. Destroyer, Godzilla actually perishes. I mentioned earlier the connection that had been established between Godzilla and nuclear energy, and Godzilla actually suffers from a meltdown. One of the things that's introduced in this film, this is Godzilla Jr., which is again the same creature that you saw in this iteration on the left and then on the previous slide. Now it starts to look in its teenage phase more like its adopted dad, and it goes to bat for Godzilla. And ultimately, both Godzilla and Jr., if you see this film, you know that they meet a terrible fate. But in the end, we're left with kind of an end to this chapter in Godzilla's career, an end to this part of the series where Junior is revived and is symbolically carrying on the torch. Another person I just want to point out was Kenpachiro Satsuma, who also passed away recently, unfortunately. Ken Satsuma was Godzilla in the Heisei series, basically from 1984 to 1995. Again, like Nakajima, took the role extremely seriously, but he was a no-nonsense guy. His Godzilla was a fighter. He was a martial artist, so he brought a lot of that athleticism to his role. And on the right, that's a photo of him playing Gigan. He actually started off in the 70s playing opponent monsters like Hedorah, the big pile of sludge that we talked about. So then something happened. We don't have to talk about this very much.
Oh, look, it's for alligator.
It bears mentioning because one of the reasons that Toho killed Godzilla in 1995, not only because they could put a big marketing campaign behind that film and sell a lot of tickets, which they did, because if you put Godzilla dies on a poster, people say, what? But they also knew that the TriStar film was on the horizon, and so they were trying to pave the way, clear the path for the TriStar film. But what happened was when the TriStar film came out, well, that's what happened. And so within a short amount of time, Toho started going back to the drawing board because they actually vocally expressed the concern that the American Godzilla was so different that the Japanese Godzilla's identity might be lost. They didn't want that to happen. And so that's why I think that's one of the strong reasons why we continue to have, both, even though we have a legendary franchise that's quite successful, the Japanese continue to make Godzilla films because they view the Japanese Godzilla as unique and different, and they want to maintain that identity. So this is another shot from our book. I want to show you these spreads and some of the fantastic photography we have. This is from Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah. Now in the Millennium series, which basically runs from 1999 to 2004, it's another iteration, another chapter. This is a unique series in that all the films are basically standalone sequels to the first film, with a little exception. But basically, each film is a standalone story that ignores everything that happened since 1954 and is a direct sequel to that. So in this particular film, which I really like, and I hope a lot of you have seen it, Godzilla is a spirit. We talked about how Japan also has its tradition of ghost stories, and certainly Godzilla, even though it's much different than much of that folklore, in this case, the director interpreted Godzilla as an onryo, which is a vengeful spirit that comes back to exact revenge on mankind for misdeeds of one or another. And in this case, Godzilla is dead-eyed, and its sole purpose is basically to wreak havoc on Japan for having forgotten the tragedy of its legacy during World War II. And it's more complicated than that. I'm grossly oversimplifying it, but it makes it for a really interesting story. And this Godzilla, because it's a vengeful spirit, is more powerful than really any other Godzilla we've seen before. And really, when it faces off with Baragon and King Ghidorah and Mothra, it's not a fair fight. It's just not a fair fight. Makes for, if you love seeing Godzilla take no prisoners and have no mercy for its opponents, it's really an interesting viewing experience. Another character that was brought back, yet again, this is basically the third iteration of Mechagodzilla, and this film is called Kiryu. This is from Godzilla against Mechagodzilla from 2002. During this time period, Toho starts going outside the system again and looking to directors outside of the Toho system. The film that we just looked at, GMK, that was directed by Shusuke Kaneko, who was a really significant and interesting and successful independent film director who had always wanted to direct a Godzilla film. But in this case, they went back to the well. Masaki Tezuka, who directed this film, was a long-time Toho farmhand, if you will. So, in 2004, who's seen Godzilla Final Wars? It's awesome. Awesome. A lot of people have come up to me and told me how much they love/hate this film. Which it's a really divisive film because it was made by a fellow named Ryuhei Kitamura. Again, Toho going outside the system, working with a director who has a maverick vision and giving that director the freedom to express her own take on Godzilla. Well, his take on Godzilla was kind of like an homage to the quote-unquote cheesy films of the 70s that sometimes people refer to them as. The thing like Godzilla flying through the air and doing the kick. I mean, this film is just all out crazy. I mean, there's so many monsters in it And then you can see that there's a tribute or a diss on the American Godzilla that in this film is just referred to as Zilla. There's another iteration of Hedorah. But this film, love it or hate it, it was really expensive. It was at that time the most expensive film in the series. Something, these numbers are usually artificial, but somewhere around $25 million was reported, which is an enormous budget for this type of film. And so, it didn't perform well at the box office, or not nearly as well as Toho had hoped and expected. This is, after all, a 50th anniversary film. So there was a lot of publicity behind it, but it just didn't perform that well. And so there was no sequel to this made, I'll tell you that. But it signals the end of an era. What is the end? What era is it the end of?
Suit Nation.
Basically, Suit Nation, yeah. The handmade tokusatsu. Tokusatsu is essentially a word that means, well, literally it means basically special filming, but it's a word that's associated with this type of special effect, handmade special effects, analog special effects. I'm again showing you, I'm going to show you a number of photographs from our book. We have a lot of sidebars and sections within the book that kind of go into great detail about, let's say, the making of the suits or the acting within the suits. And because we had access to this great photography, we're able to show you how some of these things were done. And so you can see this shot from Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, where they're putting all the Mega Nula on top of the suit. And then there's a shot, that's a shot from Mothra versus Godzilla, the 1964 film, with the making of the casting the head for the really classic looking Godzilla suit that we keep talking about. And here's how they did it. I'm going to breeze through these because I really just want to show you these rather than talk too much about them. This is Sadamasa Arikawa, and the guy in the dark glasses on the left is Teruya Shikakawa. These are the special effects directors who kind of took over for Eiji Tsuburaya. This is on the set, I believe, of Ebira, where Godzilla was the sea monster. These are the props for the giant spider, Kumonga, and the giant mantises at the son of Godzilla. And you can really get a good glimpse of how they control those with wires in the book. Look at these really highly detailed miniature sets. These are two shots from this bonkers film we were talking about, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. That's Koichi Kawakita, the special effect director of the 90s films, and that's a really good view of that big set of the Shinjuku government buildings that Godzilla destroys during the fight. This is another great miniature set, and this is, of course, when they had to raise Godzilla's height to 80 meters. Your traditional Godzilla was 50 meters, but by the time it came back from its hiatus in 1984, the skyscrapers in Shinjuku were much bigger, so they had to raise Godzilla's height, and in turn you have to make the skyscrapers or the miniatures a little smaller in scale, or you have to change the scale, and basically you lose some of the detail. But nevertheless, it's a huge, gorgeous set. Another view of, this is the Batra prop from Mothra vs. Godzilla. You can see that it's on a track for filming. This is spectacular. This was taken by a guy named Norman England, who's a journalist and writer friend in Japan, and had access to the set for Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, and he took some amazing photographs. And look how high this set goes, and up into the rafters inside the sound stage. You see this film, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I figured. This is from the end of the same, or the kind of end battle from that same film with the Mothra prop kind of in flames after getting torched by Godzilla. And also we have sections in the book that really give you an idea of what the production designs look like. We had access not only to archives of photographs, but also some of the actual production drawings and sketches from various films. So it's fun. Also, I mentioned some of these inside sections of the book where we go into detail about different techniques and methods, and this is the section about it's basically a profile of the three main suit actors. We mentioned before Haruo Nakajima from the Showa era, Ken Satsuma from the Heisei era, and the fellow on the far, if you look at that photo on the page there, the fellow in black on the far left is Tom Kitagawa. He played Godzilla in the Millennium films. I keep getting that button. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the more modern era, of course. So we move into the digital space with Godzilla. This is kind of made possible because because Toho, wanting to kind of compete in the modern era, knew that it had to like basically go outside its comfort zone. And one of the things that they did was they, even well before this film was made, several years before this film was made, they started porting a man named Hideaki Anno, who a lot of you know as the creator of Evangelion, probably the most influential anime ever created. And he's a really enigmatic kind of filmmaker, really not known for live action or even tokusatsu type filmmaking, but he's certainly a fan of it and deeply knowledgeable of this type of film. He grew up watching them and they were a prime influence on his work. But he had curated a museum exhibit in the early 2010s. I don't quote me on the year. I think it was around 2012 in Tokyo. A really well-received museum exhibit paying tribute to the original founders of Tokusatsu, to Tsuburaya, and all the people who worked with Tsuburaya. And a lot of the original props were on display. And so, and he viewed this as a tribute to the people who had inspired him. And because of the success of that, Toho had approached him. But initially he backed up. He didn't think it was something that he could do. He didn't think he was in the right frame of mind. He's somebody who openly struggles with mental health issues. Also, he was trying to get a new Evangelion project back on track. But within a short time span, he agreed to do this. Toho again gave him a carte blanche, essentially. The film was, Shin Godzilla was essentially made by Anno's production company, and it was co-directed by a man named Shinji Higuchi, who was more steeped in tokusatsu. He had directed the special effects, as you probably know, or a lot of you probably know, for the Gamera trilogy that came out in the 1990s. It was really well received. Also, so this is a period of time when Toho, again, is going outside the box, working with other filmmakers, other production companies, essentially farming Godzilla out to a lot of different people with different points of view who really are taking the character in different directions. It's kind of remarkable given the symbiosis between anime and kaiju. With, Godzilla doesn't exist in a vacuum. I would hope that's clear to everybody. It's part of this overall expression by the Japanese people through art, through film, through anime, through various media, of coming to terms with what happened during the war and during the aftermath of the war, and the whole recovery period. This whole transformation that the country was exposed to and made to undergo in the aftermath of the war, and losing its identity and having so much more cultural and other influence from the West, particularly from the United States, due to this essentially client-state type of relationship that has taken place. So, all this is to say, it's kind of interesting and remarkable that no one really ever made an anime version of Godzilla before, because it just seems like a natural fit. And when it finally happened with this trilogy that was produced by Polygon with Netflix in 2017 to 18, we got this trilogy of films that have a completely different take on Godzilla. It's a hard science fiction story set in the future, and Godzilla essentially becomes an Earth god. I'm sure a lot of you have seen it. And then a Godzilla singular point is, again, an entirely new take, and it also revives some of these classic characters. But it's, in this case, Godzilla is essentially the fulfillment of a doomsday prophecy, to simplify it. Really interesting stuff. So here we come finally to Godzilla -1. Again, working with an independent director, with an independent vision. Godzilla finally comes full circle. Godzilla was born as basically a reaction to war and to trauma. And this is a film about the generation that experienced that. I'd always wanted, and hoped for someone to make a period piece out of Godzilla, and finally it happened. But to my surprise, this is another hard reset. Just like Shin Godzilla essentially ignored everything before it and pretended that Godzilla had never existed before. And so does this film. This actually is set several years before the origin point of the first Godzilla film. This is set in actually the first scene of the movie, when we meet a sort of proto-Godzilla, takes place during the final months of the war itself. And so Yamazaki, and if you've seen any of Yamazaki's other films, I think some of them are available in streaming. He is somebody who is, well, first of all, he's one of Japan's most successful feature filmmakers in the last 20 years or so. But he has a nostalgia factor for the post-war period and the struggles that the people of Japan went through, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s. He's made a number of films about that. In this case, he backs it up into the immediate post-war period and sets the story in basically during the occupation, even though you never, for reasons that are a little perplexing to me, you never see the occupation forces in Japan. But nevertheless, I think it's truly remarkable. There's just one or two things about this film that I think are truly remarkable. Number one, it's a very Japanese story. It's set in Japanese history and Japanese culture. There are very specifically Japanese experiences that are being depicted and are being experienced by the main character of this film, who's a soldier who returns from the war, a kamikaze pilot who ducks out of his mission and suffers tremendous guilt and basically is going through horrible PTSD. And Godzilla is used really creatively in this film. Not only does it exist in the physical world, but also exists in this man's mind, haunting his dreams as a specter and kind of this, I don't know, representation of everything that he fears. And so the whole movie is essentially a redemption story for him and also for his generation, the generation that fought the war. Really interesting stuff. And yet, it's a human story and it resonated with audiences in the West and in the United States, and had a really successful theatrical run here. I also think it's really remarkable that here we've totally said goodbye to the physical or practical effects version of Godzilla. This is, to my mind, the most successful CG version of Godzilla to date, because it looks like Godzilla, but really, unlike the American Godzillas, this thing is allowed to express its power in really profound and stunning ways. Some of the things that Godzilla does in this film are unprecedented. But to understand that Godzilla, a character, and I do think of Godzilla as a character, even though it doesn't emote in a way a typical human character would, but this character that originally came to life as a man in a suit, an actor portraying a creature with human characteristics, now it's portrayed completely via CG, and it still connects with people. It still is compelling and really dramatic. And I think that the fact that the character itself can make that transformation, that transition, is really remarkable. There's just a little taste of some of the destruction. So, there's many faces of Godzilla. One of the interesting things, when you work on something like this, you think you know everything. Well, I don't think I know everything. But I'm learning things all the time, and even just little things. One of the things I learned in the process of doing this film, this book, is that especially during the early days of Godzilla, say from 1954 up to about 1972, all the Godzilla suits, the face was made from the same mold. It just came out differently. And of course, they addressed the details differently. But basically, it's the same mold all through those years. And look how different it looks. One of the wonderful things about it. So, do we have any questions? Be happy to chat with any of you. I can't see you. Hi.
What's your first exposure to Godzilla and so it's how did you feel?
Well, I shared that TV Guide ad earlier. My first exposure was just watching them on television. Now you can watch anything you want at any time and anywhere, on your phone or whatever. But in those days, it was a little different. You had to, if you were interested in a particular type of content, you would get the TV Guide and scour it every week and make marks on the pages where, and you'd have to be in front of the TV at the time that it aired. But there were feature programs all over, like television on the weekends, and I would, stay up really late or, spend on Saturday afternoon watching it. It was the first film that I saw was actually Mothra vs. Godzilla, which is Godzilla versus the Thing, and I loved it. I'm gonna ask you, you're all right, you first.
I just want to ask, when you think of the 98 Godzilla and you think of those baby,
I don't often think of it. Yes, sir.
In the book, how much kaiju media that's like not directly Godzilla is covered? Because in the Heisei era, there was the Mothra trilogy that happened,
Right.
and even things like Ultraman and Zone Rider.
Well, see, that's the problem when you
reuse Godzilla props.
This is a rich history, and Godzilla really is just the origin point of it, right?
Yeah.
It gives rise to all these other forms. So we're really just kind of like, kind of scratching the surface here. I understand that. No, the book is, Toho wanted a 70th anniversary Godzilla book. Many other things are mentioned, but it's not they need to do another book on those things that you're talking about. Because then there's, we've kind of just really glossed over things like Rodan and the Mysterians and Warrior. There's a whole other side to this. Godzilla, again, doesn't exist in a vacuum. But, it's a Godzilla book. That's what they did. That's what they want to do.
What would you personally like to see in the future for Godzilla?
That's a good one.
Like any projects or any movies?
Yeah, I thought what I thought they would do, they went a little different route. For some reason, I thought that at some point someone was going to do a remake of the original film, maybe a set of it in that time period, just with updated technology. But instead, Yamazaki, went a little bit further back in time and created an original story, and I kind of understand why he did that now. For now, I'm excited to see what he does next. I really am glad and happy that the Japanese series and the Japanese films continue, even if they're not technically a series at this point. They're basically one-offs. Let's see, anybody else? Oh, yes, sir.
Oh, okay. Might be two questions, might be two sides, same point. I know there's the eras, so you got different Godzillas, but here's the question. What's going on inside Godzilla's head? What is cognition going on? Because everyone's always talking about the kaiju. So I'm watching the movies always going, so what's going on inside? But I don't know, but there's no really way to know that, so.
Right, you can't ask it.
Yeah, have you dug up anything where the people have mentioned what might be cognition level of it?
Well, I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but I think one of the things that's interesting about the first Godzilla film is that no one asks and no explanation is given. No explanation is given or offered or asked for why it's attacking Japan, right? And so why is that? And you think you want to know, and because that maybe will help you stop it. But I think that's because of the fact that in the cultural moment of the time, Godzilla is essentially like another atomic bomb being dropped, or like another tsunami, like another typhoon, like another earthquake, which are things you can't question. And again, Japan has experienced many of these things. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the painting, The Great Wave of Kanagawa. In fact, the first appearance of Godzilla in the first film, you don't really see the monster. It's shrouded inside of essentially a typhoon, and some people who witness it aren't sure if they saw a creature or if it was just, the typhoon that was flattening the houses in the village. But yeah, actually there is a film where Godzilla talks, right? In the 70s, pretty silly stuff, but Godzilla Godzilla vs. Gigan, Godzilla and his buddy Angulas, Angulas, as they say in English, have a chit chat. In the Japanese version, they use comic book levels. Yep. Yes.
What about?
I have no concept of how much time we have, by the way.
What about the concept of Godzilla versus Kong and the monsters versus Monarch?
What about it?
Just about that.
I couldn't tell you about it. I don't hear. It's really hard for me to hear the question.
About Godzilla versus Kong, the newer series.
Yes.
With Monarch and monster versus he's balanced and everything. He's not alpha monster. You never mentioned that whole genre.
No, I didn't. Like I said, this is a Toho book, and we're here to talk about the monsters of Toho. You could do a whole other presentation on that. And I think the way things have developed, They're kind of related but different, and they exist in kind of parallel universes. So I would need another hour to talk about that stuff. But I mean, they're culturally and technically different than these films, and I think this is the text, right? This is the origin of this type of film. And you wouldn't have a monster verse if this history didn't exist, and so that's why we're looking at it today. All right, thanks for coming, everybody. Appreciate it.